In our readings today, we hear about this theme of humility. As our first reading began, "My child, conduct your affairs with humility, and you will be loved more than a giver of gifts. Humble yourself the more, the greater you are, and you will find favor with God." And then as Jesus said, those who humble themselves will be exalted. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, but those who humble themselves will be exalted. So this theme of humility. What is humility? How do I live it? Sometimes humility, I've found, can be a bit elusive. That just when I think I'm getting pretty darn good at being pretty humble, I tell myself how much more humble I am compared to the next guy, it's only then I realize I've sort of missed it. Sort of slips through my fingers as soon as I realize that I'm much more humble than him, I also used to think when I was younger that to at least give a sense of humility, that every time someone paid me a compliment, I'd immediately pay one in return. And usually an even better or bigger one than what I was paid, sort of outdo their compliment with an even bigger compliment. So I used to think this was a way of sort of doing humility. Someone would tell me, "Oh, nice hair," and so I'd compliment their hair even more. I used to have hair at one point. Or the other thing is sometimes when I would get a compliment, I would think to sort of show this humility, I had to sort of debase myself or say something, and almost denying what they said to me. "Oh, this was really good. Oh, no, it was terrible. Oh, I'm not that good." And so I thought that was me being humble. But then one day I had a friend in college who sort of called me out on that's not really being humble. Because she pointed out to me, she said, if you just give a compliment just because someone gives you a compliment, it's a little bit inauthentic. And also, when you sort of humble yourself, debase yourself when someone gives you a compliment, you're sort of almost denying the compliment they gave you. "Oh, that was really good. Oh, it was terrible." And, what are you really doing it for? He pointed out to me that perhaps I was more focused on, I was doing those things because I didn't want to seem or be perceived by the person as being too proud, vain, or conceited. So what she sort of pointed out to me that I was kind of convicted by was that even in that I was more concerned in how I was being seen by others, so there was still sort of this self-focus, and so not really humility. Even though at first level it sort of looked like humility, it's still the same problem as pride. Obsessively thinking too much about myself and how I appear to others. And so that she pointed out, a simple, genuine thank you goes a lot further ways than either an inauthentic compliment or debasing myself. So I realized then what I thought was I was living as humility was not really humility, because it was still sort of thinking too much about myself. So one definition of humility I found very helpful is humility is not thinking less of myself, it's thinking about myself less. It's not thinking less of myself, it's about thinking about myself less. In other words, in thinking about myself less and thinking more about the good of others, not being overly preoccupied with myself, including not being overly preoccupied with how I appear. And so that doesn't mean not beating the drum of my own worthlessness and misery. It's not thinking less of myself, it's thinking of myself less. So how then does one get to authentic humility that Jesus invites us, calls us to? So there's three things I want to mention that are sort of helpful ways to get at true authentic humility. The first one, number one, which is really probably the first, quickest, and surest way to authentic humility, is gratitude. Gratitude. To recognize that everything I have and am, all my gifts, all my skills, all my talents, all the blessings of my life, and yes, even my very existence itself, is sheer, total, undeserved gift from God. Everything I have and am is sheer, total, undeserved gift from God. That I did not create myself. I did not bring myself into being. I did not choose the circumstances in which I was born. I did not choose my natural gifts and talents. Or I did not, many times, even choose the circumstances in which I was able to know and believe in my gifts, or the place to cultivate and hone those gifts. Even that in itself is a gift. To recognize that my whole life, everything I have and am, is sheer, total, undeserved gift. It kind of grates against this idea of being a purely self-made man, if you will. To recognize that even if I'm successful at things in life, and yes, we do admit there is some work of my own choice and agency in it, but to recognize that even if I am successful, it's built on many, many things that were gift from around me. The family who raised me, the people around me who gave me opportunities or who saw the gifts in me that they named and called forth from me, the people who gave me the places and circumstances in which to cultivate those gifts, and so on. This, by the way, this idea of gratitude and recognizing my whole life is gift, this is one of the reasons why we are called by God to go to church every week. Because for the pure simple fact that I owe it to give thanks. St. Thomas Aquinas talks about giving praise to God as a matter of justice. That I owe it as a matter of justice to God because my life is sheer, total, undeserved gift. That I ought to formally give thanks as a regular part of my life. And that there's something about if I formally come week after week and recognize that, fall to my knees, recognizing that everything I have in my life is sheer gift, that I live better in the world. Gratitude, one of the surest and quickest ways to authentic humility. So number one is gratitude. Number two, recognizing the responsibility to use the gifts I've been given for the good of others. To recognize that my gifts aren't given to me purely for me, not merely for my own success, but all I have and am is also meant to be given as gift for others. This means that I also have to come to know my gifts. So humility is not pretending that I'm worthless and I have no gifts. It's not thinking less of myself, it's thinking about myself less. So this idea of, it's not pretending I'm worthless, but rather thinking about how can my needs be of, or how can my gifts serve the needs of others, the good of others. It's thinking more about the needs and good of others than myself. So how can I use the gifts that I have for the good of others? And recognizing that my gifts aren't for my own glory, but for the good of others. And with this is recognizing that the more gifts I have, the greater gifts I have, the greater responsibility I have to labor for the good of others. One movie that was very impactful on me growing up was Spider-Man. And if you may have seen the original Spider-Man movie in the 2000s, one of the famous lines from there was, after Spider-Man, Peter Parker received his powers, his wise Uncle Ben says this famous line, "With great power comes great responsibility." With great power comes great responsibility. In other words, the more we find ourselves in a position of power and influence, or find ourselves in positions where we are very blessed with many great gifts, the greater responsibility we have to serve the common good, to work and labor for the good of others. Positions of power is meant to be in the service of love and goodness of others, rather than the other way around. But also in recognizing my gifts through humility is also to recognize the limitations of those gifts, where perhaps others have gifts. Which brings us to number 3. Number 1, gratitude. Number 2, recognizing my gifts are meant to be used for others. And number 3, naming the gifts in other people. Naming the gifts in other people. Usually we discover some of our own gifts because there's others who see them in us and name them and call them out for us. So we too are to do that for others, to call forth the gifts of others, to name them in others, and to see the gifts in others not as something threatening to me, but as a gift. That sometimes when we see someone else who's successful or has gifts that I don't have, the temptation can be to become envious, to somehow see their gifts as a threat to me and my own success. But again, that goes back to the original problem of being overly preoccupied with oneself. But rather to move to this place to see the gifts of others that I don't have as gift. Which brings us full circle back to that whole idea of gratitude. To not only give gratitude for the gifts of my own life, but give gratitude for the gifts that I see, that I experience in others, from others. Gifts that perhaps I don't have, that I can be grateful for, that I can give thanks to God for, that I can thank them for using. And so it begins and ends with gratitude. So those 3 things that'll help cultivate humility. Gratitude. Number 2, recognizing my responsibility to use my gifts for others. And number 3, naming and calling forth the gift in others. Which, as I said, brings us all back to gratitude. And that will do much to get one on a fast track to authentic humility. Just not thinking less of myself, but thinking about myself less. My child, conduct your affairs with humility, and you will be loved, more than a giver of gifts. Humble yourself the more, the greater you are, and you will find favor with God. Amen.